Blair, thanks so much for being here today. You are the chairman of TELUS International. For people who don't know TELUS, it's one of Canada's largest telecommunication companies. You're also a venture capitalist and a philanthropist. And in this brief video interview, I'm going to be asking you about areas of leadership. What should be leaders be thinking about? I'm going to talk about culture and politics. I'm going to talk about innovation. I'm going to talk about how do you write a business case that convinces legacy executives to take action and move. And then finally, I want to end the conversation around things like strategy, data, execution, and then some career advice for all the young entrepreneurs who are getting into the workforce today, or young people joining the workforce today, as well as unfortunately we are now in a times where we're going to see massive amounts of unemployment. And so given you being chief operating officer of a major corporation, group president like that, I also love to get some career advice from you for folks that are going to be looking for their next employment role.
Sounds great, Taimour. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So first, I'm going to start about leadership, and I want to start with a question of, given today's market, it's a very uncommon place to find ourselves.
Yeah.
And the best question I guess I can ask you is, what are the leadership skill sets that you feel is missing from what you're seeing in the marketplace, and why?
Yeah, I'll give you an answer that I think is applicable not only to the times we're in now with COVID-19 being rampant around the world, but also an answer I think is true before and after the time we find ourselves in now. And I think there's been a lot said on leadership in respect of you need to be a great strategist. You also need to be great at execution, and you need to be great at customer focus. And I think those three things are ultra important and support them. But from the question of what's missing, I'm going to go a slightly different angle, which might be surprising, which I think empathy is missing. And what I mean by empathy is the want to understand and support the mindset of your employees, the mindset of your customers, understanding what they're going through, what their needs are, and supporting that. And, putting aside the difficult economic times we're going to go through, probably over the next year or two at least, I think we will get back into a world where it's an employees market as opposed to an employers market. And we're back into that war for talent as the baby boomer generation starts to retire in particular. And I think by being more attuned to your employees, more attuned to what your customers want, you're going to be more effective as an organization. And I think the day of tops-down hierarchical leadership, which really has been in place since the Second World War, is starting to wane. And you're going to see a world where companies and teams want to be more participative. And you want ideas coming from all team members at all levels of the organization in order to be able to beat out the competition and support your customers as well as possible. At TELUS, we always tried to run the company through a formula, which is if we have a more engaged, committed, motivated team, they're going to serve our customers better. That's going to create better customer loyalty, which is going to result in better economics between our customers and the company, which is going to result in better total shareholder returns. And I think a lot of companies talk that formula, but it's very hard to make happen in real life. And often the financial bottom line will become the pure focus, and people will vary from that formula as a result. But I think if you stick to that formula and stick to it for the long term, it works. Like if you look at TELUS against all the incumbent telcos around the world, so take Verizon, Telstra, British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, you name it, and you look, since the turn of millennium, over the past 20 years, TELUS has the best total shareholder return of any of those telecoms. And I think it's because of really running that formula well. And if you think about it, at the core of that formula is empathy, focusing on a great team member experience and a great customer experience.
Very cool. Very cool. Very cool. Yesterday, I was talking to I'm sidetracking now. Yesterday, I
Yeah,
was
please.
talking to a doctor who used to work for one of your largest suppliers, one of TELUS's largest suppliers. And
Yeah.
this is the company, you would know their name. And they have they're like a Fortune, definitely on the Fortune 100 companies out there. And this technology company started to have divisions like a consulting division for healthcare, consulting division for financial services, and so on. And they had retained this particular doctor to head their healthcare division. I met him 20 years ago. And so yesterday he and I were chatting on a project that I'm working on. I said, oh, by the way, what happened to this company you used to work for? And he said, I know they went into these business units. Man, they sucked at doing that, going into business units. And so the entire team got dismantled, I don't know, 15 years, like 5 years after or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And then I thought to myself, the comment you just made about having a formula, that's probably a lot of corporations didn't think about the formula and stuff like that. So good for you. Good for you. That's awesome. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about office politics with you. Kind of like if I am working in a large corporation that has over 40,000 employees, there's probably a likelihood that there's that annoying person that's just super annoying. Yeah. And I wanted to get advice from you, given that you were group president and CEO of a very large corporation. What are the what are best practices or advices or stories that you've seen? And I just want to tell you, this is probably one of my favorite questions to ask, because I always learn something like I never thought about before. And I'll give you an example of it.
Yeah.
I am beer buddies with head of innovation for a Fortune, I'm going to say 50 software company globally. And I asked this global head, and he reports out to the CEO of the company. So I asked them, hey, let's say his name is Josh. So I said, hey, Josh, how do you deal with office politics? There must be some annoying people for you out there in the massive corporation you work for. He said, oh, that's easy for me. I just have a recruiter that I retain, and I pay that recruiter to find a person who I find annoying a job.
That's an innovative approach.
Josh, I've never thought about it that way. So I was like, seriously? He goes, yeah. I said, how many times have you done that? He goes, 10 or 12 times. No problem.
Wow.
He hires a recruiter, not for himself, but that person who finds it annoying to get that person a job. And that person doesn't even know. And the fact that he's done it 10 to 12 times, I just thought fascinating.
That is, yeah.
So now let's go down the food chain. Not every employee has a budget to hire.
Yeah.
A recruiter. So how would you do it?
It's a situation that exists far more prevalently than I think most of us would give it credit for. And I'll come at it from two angles. The first angle is, if you're the leader and this person is on your team and they're dragging down your team, if you're not dealing it up, I think it's a leadership failure, to be really blunt. And you've heard a lot of people, like to go back to Jack Welch, say, you got to have both the ability to deliver results and the ability to do it. And unless you have both, you can't stay. Again, I think something that many people practice. I know Darren Antis was a big driver of that at TELUS. But I should say a lot of people talk about, but a lot of people don't practice it. So I think if you're not dealing it up as the leader, it's a leadership failure. As the leader, I think there's two ways to deal it up. One is often an individual who has a level of toxicity in the work environment, just hasn't been invited to contribute for many years, and they feel they've been on the sideline for many years, and they've kind of got stuck in a rut. They don't know how to put their hand up and say, hey, I've got some great ideas, I want to contribute. And sometimes as a leader, if you really engage with that individual and say, hey, I see why you're saying no to a bunch of things, but what are your alternative ideas? I need your creative brain. I need your alternative ideas. Sometimes you can bring that person back to the front of what you're trying to achieve and get them excited and make them a different person again. However, I think if that is unsuccessful, I think you need to move that person on and help them find a different job. It might be the recruitment process you mentioned, or it might just, you might have to part ways with them and through a difficult decision. But it's totally unfair to have one person who's dragging down the rest of the team. If you think of, if I can go nerdy for a second, there was, Spock, who said the needs of the few or the many outweigh the needs of the one. And I think that's an important thing to think about as a leader. Too often, we'll tolerate that toxic person because they still deliver good results, but we don't think about how much they're dragging down the performance of the overall team. Now, on the flip side, if you're not the leader, if you're a peer of that individual, and your leader's not doing anything to address their behavior, or maybe you've talked to your leader about it and they're still not addressing the behavior, what I always told people I was mentoring over the years is I said, you don't have to yourself be political, but you need to be politically astute. So you need to understand what politics are being played, and you don't necessarily have to play them, but you have to be aware enough of what's happening such that you can navigate it wisely. And then my view is take the high road at that point. So don't do something that's going to shoot yourself in the foot, but take the high road. And it's interesting when there's a negative, toxic person in the environment who plays office politics. Typically, they're trying to goad you into politicking back and forth with them, and often they're more skilled at it than you are. But if you take the high road and you don't make them look bad, you just say, hey, let's go here, and all ships will rise with the rising tide. It's a great way to go because it shows well on you. It's not negative on the toxic person. They start to see an example that gets rewarded of people taking the high road. So those are my thoughts on that. But it's a significant challenge in the workplace, and one that I think deserves more attention than it gets today in leadership books and the like.
For sure. Yeah, I love the fact that they may have not had a chance to contribute and to kind of like partner with them. That's brilliant. Thank you. In Canada, a lot of our corporations are small business owners. And in a lot of these organizations, you have what I call as a legacy executive. The guy started the company 20 years ago. Don't tell him what he's going to do wrong, or her. But even in larger corporations, you have executives in large corporations that are, I'm going to say, from the old school. The best way I can describe them are legacy executives.
Yeah.
And this particular story, this particular case study comes from one of Canada's banks. And a person who I have a relationship with was a senior vice president in one of Canada's largest banks. And he decided to resign from the company. And so when I was asking him, why did he resign? He said that he pitched a digital transformation initiative to the CEO and all the executives. And although they said yes in the boardroom, they never went to implement it. And he got to a point where he got frustrated and he left. And that's a story that points to a large company. But I also know a lot of, the lack of better word, small consultants who are kind of pitching innovation, a better way of doing something to the CEO of a non-for-profit organization or small business owner. And the biggest one of the challenges I would say Canada has is how do you convince that legacy executive to sign off on that better idea, the innovation, digital transformation, whatever the word of the day is.
Yeah.
My question to you is, I bet you were part of lots of these so-called big ideas, transformation ideas. Can you give me some best practices on how do you convince a legacy executive who, I don't want to say they're stuck, but kind of like stuck in that old view, to actually, take a jump and sign up for it?
Yeah, to me, there's only two methods I've ever come across that work when you're in that situation. So the first method is doing a pilot. And I find often, say you're going to an executive team or a business owner, and you're talking about some big change. Often it's just too big and too scary for them to process. They got a million things on the go. They got to deliver this quarter's results, the year's results. They got crocodiles biting at their ankles, etc. But if you go to them and say, look, here's an ultimate vision of what could be achieved, but let me run a pilot in this smaller area of the company, or with just this team in the company, or just in this community with our customers, not nationwide. And let's see whether the pilot proves out or not. That's a method that can work really well, because then you can start to show results through the pilot, and then someone who's skeptical or worried about the magnitude of the change can say, hey, I want those results more broadly based on what that pilot delivered. And that tends to be a project that works really well. I remember at TELUS when we were first implementing what we called work styles, which is really just the ability to work remotely or work from home, which obviously is super important in these times, but we were doing it back in 2006. And our CEO, as I said earlier, Darren Entwistle, was super on board with it, but we had multiple levels of management that weren't. They were old school. They wanted to see people in the office. They wanted to see the hours they worked, etc. And so him and I kind of figured out, well, let's run a pilot and let's just run it in a small area of the company. And that started to prove out, and people started to see the results, and more productive teams and happier employees, etc. And over a period of, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, it went from this little small thing to a company-wide effort, to the point where other companies started using TELUS as a consultant to figure out how to do it. So that pilot approach really works. The second approach that I've seen work is to introduce leaders to the concept of the ambidextrous organization. And I was introduced to this by a really renowned professor at Harvard called Dr. Michael Tushman. And with a fellow, I believe, named Charles O'Reilly III, if memory serves me correctly, they authored this initial paper called The Ambidextrous Organization. You can find it just by Googling it, Harvard Business Review also. And it's a fairly short read, and what it talks about is every org needs to be constantly reinventing itself. But you need to do it almost with two arms of your body. So let's say your right arm is your existing business that's got a lot of work to do, is performing well, etc. That's your exploit arm of your company. And all you're doing is trying to make your existing business run as well as possible, better than it did yesterday, better tomorrow than it did today. But you also need a separate team, typically a much smaller team, looking at the explore side of your business. So say that's your left hand. And that's looking at where's the future and how can we reinvent ourselves for the future? Because if we don't, there's going to be competitors that come along and totally destroy us as a company by leveraging a disruptive technology or a disruptive mindset in the market. There's tons of examples of companies that we thought were too big to fail, but failed. And in fact, most big companies over a period of 50 years won't survive if you look at the stats. And so often when people read the ambidextrous org, it's just written in a way that helps them to really understand, to say, wow, I'm not trading off one for the other, I'm doing both. So with my right hand, I am exploiting my current organization to be the best it can be. And with my left hand, I'm exploring new possibilities for the future of our company, 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now, whatever horizon I want to look at. So those would be my two suggestions.
I love it. Brilliant, brilliant. One of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier was, and you didn't say it in these words, I'm just going to say it, you had a way within TELUS to sense data. You had a source of data coming to you that made you say, oh, I need to work on this. So example that you touched on, or you said, was we needed a formula where teams could work better to have that team experience, but also customer-facing experience. A few years ago, I had a roundtable with, she's now the former CMO of Allstream, and this former CIO, he's now the former CIO of Rogers. And one of the biggest frustrations these two individuals had at the time was, she said to me, Taimour, I have to make decisions instantly, and I often don't have all the data I need to make that decision. I love how you're nodding your head. It sounds like you've been there, done that.
Yeah, many times. Yeah. You know, go ahead. Sorry.
How do you get it? How do you find? Tell me, whether you're a CEO of any company, where do you get your data from? How do you go capture data to figure out what are things you need to be looking for, thinking about, like that? Not every company who's a telecom company, the size of TELUS, big or small, whatever, said, oh, I need to go figure out a formula for employees and, you know, for teams to work better. Not everybody asked that question. The fact that you asked that question suggests that you had a data source that said, this is a question you should be asking, therefore go work on this.
Yeah.
Tell me about that piece. That's really critical, I think.
Yeah, I think three thoughts that come to mind for me. The first, I think a lot of people who are frustrated by the data available to them, or the confusion or lack of usability of the data available to them, not always, but often I find the root cause of the issue is they start from the perspective of, I want the following data available to me. Mm-hmm. You know, and sometimes that data is available, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it takes a while to build a database that can pull in that data, clean it properly, make it available. What I would encourage, you know, especially for young individuals earlier in their career, don't start from the perspective of data, start from the perspective of insight. And say, these are the insights I want available to me, as opposed to the data I want available to me. And why that's important is that allows your data architects and your database technicians, etc., to figure out a way to get you those insights based on the data that they can create and clean properly. And I think often we get too stuck in, I want this data, as opposed to help me figure out insights that will allow me to make proper decisions. You know, I think a classic example of that is, you know, a company I think interested in data will want to know what's my customer satisfaction, how long was I on the phone with each customer, you know, how many times has that customer called. All of those are good data points. I don't argue them, they're good data points, but I think the company that's looking for insights would be looking more at, is a customer going to recommend me or not to their peers? Often in the US, you'll hear this called the Net Promoter Score. So I think the insights angle is more important than the data angle. The second thought it raises for me, and this is something, again, my previous CEO, Darren, was a huge champion of, is what gets measured gets done. And again, something that's often talked about, but often not practiced well enough. So by way of example, in about the 2008 timeframe, if memory serves me correctly, TELUS started to make a pivot to say, yes, technology is important, and as a telco, we've always been focused on technology. But in the new era, the customer is going to be even more important than technology. So we started to make that pivot. And a lot of companies say that and have great slogans and say, hey, you know, we're going to put, you know, this focus on the customer, etc. But what we did at TELUS is we actually made our scorecard, which determines the bonus of all employees, from the frontline employee all the way to the executive employee, determines their bonus. We made it at least 50%, and typically more than 50% weighted on what our customers thought of us as a company and how we were doing with our customers. And most Fortune 500 companies or TSX 60 companies, TSX 300 companies, if you looked at their scorecard, it would be 80% financial, if not 100% financial. So the fact that we shifted to 50% plus being customer oriented made for a huge shift in our culture. And when you're trying to change the direction of a ship of 50,000 people, you got to be very surgical in how you make that happen. So what gets measured gets done is my second thought. And then my final thought is we live in an imperfect world and when it comes to data. And so I think this is, again, super important for young up-and-coming leaders, is you're never going to have, or typically you're not going to have, all the data you want to make a decision. And I can tell you now, my experience over my career has been, it's always been way more effective to make a decision with 70 or 80% of the information and move the organization forward. You're going to make mistakes, but be humble enough, have enough humility to identify them and course correct as you go. It's way better to do that than to wait for 90%, 100% of the data to be available and then to make your decision. And that's because you lose so much time in between in a dynamic, competitive, disruptive technology world that you just don't move fast enough as a team or as an organization, and other organizations and teams pass you. So sure. I would say get comfortable making decisions with an imperfect level of information.
Love it. Brilliant. So making decisions based by the data you have. Let's talk about execution.
Yeah.
Every business leader that I know of has a strategy, has a plan, has a goal. Almost everybody gets stuck on the execution. From your years of experience, what are some best practices for the execution and getting the execution done? Where do you see people struggling to get that execution done? And what advice do you have for the companies you're working with?
The best process, method, formula, whatever you call it, that I've come across for execution, and there's many, so don't get me wrong, different people have different preferences, but for me, the one that has always worked the best is something called fair process. And it's a methodology I was introduced to at INSEAD. If I recall correctly, the professor is named Ludo Vanderhaven. Done a bunch of research and come up with this methodology called fair process. And the concept behind fair process is that you need to get the people who a decision is going to impact or a change is going to impact and give them a voice in getting to that decision or getting through that change. And the concept is by doing that, by getting people involved, they're going to be more willing to participate and own the execution on the other side. And so he has 5 steps or INSEAD has 5 steps that they say you should follow. The first one's being engaged, so get those people involved. Second one is explore, so explore different potential approaches, outcomes, whatever you're talking about. And maybe you come up with 5 or 6 different ways to do it. And then the third step is explain. It's really decide and explain, but they wanted to go with 5 E's, so they called it explain. But it says the leader, if your team can't reach consensus on the best way forward, you're accountable to make a decision on the way forward, but you have to explain why you picked that option, because remember, our team has come up with the options here. So if there's 5 options and you don't explain why you picked option 3, you might piss off all the people who are supporters of options 1, 2, 4, and 5. However, if you explain and you say, look, I didn't pick 1, 2, 4, and 5 for these reasons, and this is the reason I picked option 3. Your team typically will be able to say, okay, I understand his logic. I may not agree with it, but at least I understand Josh's logic. He made a decision. Let's work with him on the 4th stage, which is execution. And then the 5th stage is evaluate. So evaluate how you did and how you can run the process of the 5 E's or fair process better in the future. So a couple things that are important about that process. One is it is a slower upfront process than just a top-down decision-making model. So often type A personalities will shy away from this process at first because no, I don't have 2 weeks to make this decision. But what the process proves out that is, yes, maybe it takes you 2 weeks to make a decision, but your execution, rather than being 6 months, can be done in 3 months. So overall, you save yourself a lot of time and you get a lot more effective implementation. The second thing that's important to know about fair process is the words itself. It is fair process, not necessarily fair outcome. And it's important to help your stakeholders understand that, because in some cases you might be applying it to something very difficult. Like maybe you need to reduce the size of your company from 100 employees down to 50. You can still go through a fair process and involve your team in making that decision. And I guarantee you they're going to leave feeling a bit more positive about how the decision was made, why it was made, etc., as opposed to just one day they show up and there's pink slips on their desk. So that's a drastic example. Others might just be a change in how you do business, etc. But it is fair process, not fair outcome, which is an important thing to make your team realize, because you're never going to make decisions that always make everyone happy.
I love it. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was insightful. Thank you. Awesome.
Pleasure.
So let's talk about differentiation.
Yeah.
So in the telecommunication world, 20 years ago, long distance was not long distance. Today, a cell phone is a cell phone plan. How do you differentiate in a noisy world? Everybody has a YouTube channel, Facebook page. Everybody's on social media, whatever people do. What are the best practices do you see in terms of differentiation?
I think there's a lot of different approaches to differentiation. So, for example, you can go wide. And what I mean by wide is you can say, I'm going to be someone who provides multiple services or products. So if my competitors are providing 3, I'm going to effectively provide 6. And so I'm going to be wider, and I'm going to differentiate myself on bundle, if you will. I think you can differentiate yourself through depth. So you can say, look, my competitors are providing 3 things. I'm going to provide 1, but I'm going to provide it with way more thoughtfulness, effectiveness, seamlessness than my competitors are. So even if someone takes the other 2 things from my competitor, they're going to take this 1 from me. I think also being someone whose eyes wide open to where the marketplace is going and where the world is going is a smart thing to do. And just one quick example from my past, if you go back again to kind of that 2007-8 time frame, all of our competitors in the Canadian telecom space were going into content, providing television stations. So, whether it was Global or CTV or whatever, they were all getting into the content ownership business. We looked around and said, what's one of the biggest challenges in the world? And we thought it was the rising costs of healthcare. And so again, Darren Entwistle at the time said, let's make our bet on the digitization of healthcare to improve the effectiveness of healthcare delivery. And at the time, a bunch of people said, wow, and a bunch of the stock market said, well, everyone else is going this way, going stage left. Why are you going stage right? And so you have to stick to your convictions sometimes, because often the world will think you're wrong when you're differentiating.
Yeah, sure.
But those are different ways to differentiate, and there's others too. But when you find a path that is quite different, you need to have the conviction to stick to it, because you'll have a lot of people tell you, what, that doesn't make sense, that's not right. Even think about it. We're talking about how there's a lot of unemployed people that are going to be coming out of the times we're in right now. A lot of prevailing wisdom is going to be just go get a standard salary job. Regardless of what the job is, just get one, and for a lot of people, that's going to be the correct answer. Some individuals may find inside themselves that they've got something different driving them. They want to be an entrepreneur, they want to be a consultant, they want to be, whatever it is driving them. They want to be in the not-for-profit sector. There'll be a lot of people telling them, don't do that. Like the safe thing to do right now is get a salary job. And so you have to decide, do I want to listen to what my heart is telling me and have conviction, or do I want to fall back and take that salary job? So just another example, but, try different things. I have found in my career, I learn a lot more from my mistakes than I do from my successes, a lot more.
Sure.
Unless you're willing to try things and things that have a high probability of failing, you're not going to make those mistakes and learn.
Sure.
So try new things and you'll find stuff that works for you, and then have the conviction to stick to it.
Sure. Awesome. Well, let's talk about career advice for a minute.
Yeah.
And here's the background of where I want to start from. Frank Dina is, I feel, one of the leading futurists in the world. Today he works for Tata Consulting Services, TCS.
Yeah.
He's at the par level of Amy Webb and just some of the leading futurists. I did a similar interview with him a couple of years ago, and he's just a guy who I find this guy fascinating. And he gave me the example of an autonomous truck. And he asked me to imagine or picture an autonomous truck just driving through a highway. And he got me to see that truck is not stopping for coffee.
Yeah.
That truck is not stopping for, the tire needs to be repaired or something like that. And in a later conversation, he was showing me autonomous dispatchers. And the economic impact to that is all the coffee shops on the highways that are making a living from selling coffee to truck drivers, well, that business just disappears or dramatically gets eliminated or reduced. And that's level one. But then municipal governments who are collecting taxes from those retailers selling coffee, tire, hotels, or whatever it is you sell on the highway thing, all that, the municipal revenue disappears. And this is a massive economic impact to something called the autonomous truck.
Yeah.
If you talk to people like Alan Milton, the executive director of Schulich School of Business, he will tell you a lot of the jobs of the future have not been invented yet.
Yeah.
So that's a background context. Fast forward to today, you've got kids graduating from schools, universities looking for income, let out, and then you've got a massive displacement of people either due to Corona or technology. What advice do you have for them in terms of these people finding their career?
Yeah, great question. First thought is, I think how we define or have defined careers in the past is something we need to throw away. And I think I've got two sons, 14 and 18, right? And I watch a lot of way people talk to them about a career, and it's well, what are you going to be? You're going to be a doctor, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a carpenter. Like, it's kind of one thing. Pick one thing, and that's your career. And to the thoughtfulness of your question, I don't necessarily think that's what success is going to be like in the future. And not to say those aren't great careers, and I would encourage people to be in those careers, but where I'm going is, I think the career mindset needs to be something of, I need to constantly evolve as an individual. And that would be my advice to young folks now is don't feel like the decision you're going to make today is going to define the rest of your life. And I know a lot of young individuals find that stressful. Like, if I choose to be that lawyer, I'm going to have to be that for the rest of my life. that's not the case. I mean, I even look at myself. I was an engineer by training. I spent 12 years in human resources. Most of my jobs the last few years have been leading businesses where I haven't been making technology decisions. There's people who do that for me. So I think being willing to evolve as an individual is very important from a career perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, given the times we're in, when we emerge, I think there's a high probability, if not even 100% probability, we're going to emerge into a recession after we get out of these dark, scary times.
Sure.
In times of recession, sometimes, like I was saying earlier, you do just have to take what's available. There isn't something exciting that really turns your crank that's available for work. You do have to take what's available. But I think if you're someone who thinks about constantly evolving yourself, there's a couple of things you can do regardless of what your current job is. And one is continuously learn. About the company you're working for or the role you're doing, but also other things, in your own time. Read, do research, talk to different people, build a network, just learn about different things that are happening so you can increase, your mental resume, if you will, your mental capabilities and capacity. And the second thing is, I think, seek out new experiences. So constantly grow yourself as an individual by doing new experiences. So, in a big company, I'll often talk to individuals who are young and they just want to move up the corporate ladder right away. Like, how do I get to be a vice president in 7 years or whatever? I'll often say to them, I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think the better thing to do is try a few different roles at each level, because then when you go to the next level, you're going to understand the company, how we service our customers that much better. You're going to be able to handle the stress of that level much better. So try different experiences. So that's a big company example. But say you're someone coming out and say we are in a recession and you just have to take the job you can. And maybe it's not a job you're super excited about. Do a good job of that job. That's still very important to do. But you can also gain experience through many other means, right? You can volunteer at not-for-profit organizations that need help. You can do what you're so good, which is coming up with ideas and projects and pulling people together that would have a common interest in that project and then leading that project. So there's many different ways to gain different experiences that, again, prepare you for this future of change and jobs that don't exist today that will be the jobs of the future. So, that would be my advice is, sometimes you have to take the job that's available, especially if you're in a recession. Do the best you can at that job. Try many different roles in that company if it's a bigger company. Always be looking for new experiences that you can do outside of your day job. And then be a continuous learner. I think that's what it comes down to.
I love it. Josh Blair, thanks so much for your time. These are some really valuable insights. I certainly love the giving people a voice, for sure. Moving ahead with if you have 80%, move that. I love the process for execution. Thank you so much. It's just like everything you mentioned, like there was like golden nuggets, a lot of that. So thanks so much for sharing your wisdom.
Well, thank you. I think the success of sessions like these is based on the thoughtfulness of the questions, which you nailed to a T. So appreciate that, Taimour.
Thank you.